Well, let me tell you, I've seen a lot in my time. 62 years, most of them spent in hospitals, and I thought I'd seen it all. I'm Caleb Beaumont, by the way, retired now, but I used to be a senior physician at St. Jude S. Trained half the nurses there, delivered more babies than I can count, patched up folks from all walks of life. Figured I'd earned a little respect. But that's not how it always goes, is it? This whole thing started when I went to visit old George Miller. George was a colleague of mine, a good doctor, recovering from a nasty bout of pneumonia. I figured he could use a friendly face. So I popped in one afternoon, found him sitting up in bed, looking a bit pale. We were chatting about the old days, reminiscing about some particularly tricky cases we'd handled together. I was just telling him about this one fella who swallowed a whole chicken bone, don't ask me how, when this young surgeon, Ethan Myers, walks in. Myers, he's all sharp angles and crisp white coats, thinks he's God's gift to medicine. Now, I was in the middle of explaining to George how we managed to get that chicken bone out without major surgery, a delicate procedure, mind you, when Myers cuts me off. Just like that. Doesn't even acknowledge me. He looks at George and starts talking about his post-op care, all technical jargon and fancy medical terms. George, bless his heart, he's a bit confused, so I try to clarify something Myers said. And that's when it happened. Myers turns to me, this condescending look on his face, and says, clear as day, loud enough for the whole ward to hear, "Stop talking if you don't know." Just like that. Stopped me dead in my tracks. I could feel my face flush. The nurses at the station, some of whom I'd personally trained, they all looked up, saw the whole thing. The shame, it just washed over me. All those years, all that experience, all the lives I'd touched, it just evaporated in that instant. Like I was nothing, just some doddering old fool who didn't know what he was talking about. I just stood there for a second, speechless. George, he looked embarrassed for me. Myers, he just carried on like nothing happened, adjusting George's IV drip, talking down to him like he was a child. I finally mumbled something about needing to leave and practically backed out of the room. The silence of those nurses, my former students, stung worse than anything Myers had said. They just looked away. It was like I didn't even exist. I walked out of that hospital room feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. The disrespect, the dismissal, it just kept replaying in my head. As I drove home, my mind wandered back over the years. I remembered starting out fresh-faced and eager, ready to make a difference. Long hours, sleepless nights, the constant pressure, but I loved every minute of it. There was a real satisfaction in helping people, in easing their pain, in bringing new life into the world. I wasn't just a doctor, I was a teacher too. I spent countless hours mentoring young doctors, sharing my knowledge, guiding them through the complexities of medicine. I remember the pride I felt watching them grow, becoming skilled physicians in their own right. Many of the nurses at St. Jude's, I'd trained them myself, taught them the importance of compassion, the value of a gentle touch, the power of a kind word. I always stressed the importance of listening to patients, treating them with respect, no matter their background or condition. It was more than just medicine. It was about human connection. I'd seen so much in my time. Delivered babies in the back of taxis, performed emergency surgeries with limited resources, comforted grieving families in the dead of night. I'd held the hands of dying patients, whispered words of comfort, offered a sense of peace in their final moments. There were triumphs, of course, the successful surgeries, the miraculous recoveries, the grateful smiles of patients and their families. And there were tragedies too, the lives lost, the battles fought and lost against relentless diseases. It was all part of the tapestry of a life dedicated to healing. I remembered the respect I used to command, the way colleagues would seek my opinion, the trust patients placed in my hands, the quiet confidence I felt knowing I was making a real difference. I'd received awards, accolades, letters of gratitude, but none of that mattered now. It all felt meaningless in the face of that young doctor's arrogance, the indifference of the nurses I'd trained. It was like my entire career, my entire life's work had been erased in a single, dismissive sentence. It was a heavy weight to bear, the weight of erasure, the feeling of being invisible, irrelevant, like I was nothing more than a ghost haunting the halls of the hospital I dedicated my life to. The silence in my car on the drive home was deafening, louder than any siren I'd ever heard. It wasn't just Myers' words echoing in my ears, it was the silence of the nurses. The ones I'd taught, mentored, guided. They'd seen the whole thing. Seen the disrespect, the casual dismissal, and they'd said nothing, done nothing, just looked away. That hurt more than anything Myers could have said. It felt like a betrayal, not just of me but of everything I'd taught them. The compassion, the empathy, the simple human decency I tried to instill in them. It was all gone, erased. I sat in my armchair, staring out the window but seeing nothing. My wife, Martha, bless her heart, she tried to comfort me. Offered me tea, a warm blanket, a listening ear. But I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. It was like a hole had been ripped in the fabric of my being. All those years, all that effort, all the sacrifices, for what? To be treated like I was nothing, like I was some senile old man who didn't know his scalpel from his stethoscope. I kept replaying the scene in my head. Myers' condescending tone, his dismissive words, the nurses' averted gazes. It was a loop, playing over and over, each repetition deepening the wound. I felt a profound sense of loss. Not just the loss of respect, but the loss of purpose. What was I supposed to do now? My whole life had revolved around medicine, around the hospital. It was my identity, and now it felt like that identity had been stripped away. The silence of the nurses kept gnawing at me. They knew me. They knew my history, my contributions. They knew I wasn't some clueless old man. And yet they'd chosen to remain silent. Perhaps they were afraid of Myers, of his authority. Perhaps they were simply indifferent. Whatever the reason, their silence felt like a confirmation of my irrelevance, a final nail in the coffin of my professional life. I felt erased, minimized, like all I'd accomplished, all I'd contributed, had been wiped away with a single, dismissive sentence. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of indifference, lost and forgotten, a ghost in my own life. The despair didn't last forever, though. Martha, she's a wise woman. She just sat with me, patiently, letting me stew in my own juices for a while. Then, when the time was right, she gently reminded me of all the good I'd done. Reminded me of the lives I'd saved, the patients I'd comforted, the doctors and nurses I'd trained. She told me that one arrogant young surgeon couldn't erase all of that. She was right, of course. It started slowly, a little flicker of defiance, like a pilot light reigniting in the darkness. I started thinking about all the knowledge I still possessed, the experience I'd accumulated over the years. It was still there, inside me, waiting to be used. Myers might think he knew everything, but he was still wet behind the ears. He had the book smarts, sure, but he lacked the wisdom that comes with years of experience, the intuition that can only be honed through countless hours in the trenches. I realized that my value wasn't tied to my position at the hospital, to my title, or to the respect of some arrogant young surgeon. My value came from within, from the dedication I'd always shown to my patients, from the commitment I'd made to the art of healing. That couldn't be taken away from me. Not by Myers, not by anyone. The anger started to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. I wasn't ready to be sidelined. I wasn't ready to let my legacy be tarnished by some upstart who thought he knew it all. I might be retired, but I wasn't finished. There was still fire in my belly, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. I might not be wearing a white coat anymore, but I was still a doctor. And I wasn't going to let anyone forget that. Something had to be done. I wasn't sure what yet, but I knew I couldn't just let this go. I had to find a way to reclaim my dignity, to remind myself, and maybe even Myers, that experience still counts for something. A plan began to form, a small seed of an idea taking root in my mind. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about justice, about reminding everyone, including myself, that a lifetime of dedication can't be erased by a single moment of disrespect. The seed of an idea, planted by Martha's words and watered by my own stubborn pride, began to grow. I wouldn't let Ethan Myers get away with this. I wouldn't let him diminish my life's work, my dedication to healing. This wasn't about getting even, not in the usual sense. It was about something more. It was about upholding the standards of the profession I loved, the standards I'd lived by for decades. It was about protecting patients, making sure they received the best possible care, the care they deserved. And if I was being honest with myself, it was about reclaiming my own self-respect. I knew I couldn't just storm into the hospital and demand an apology. That wasn't my style. Besides, it wouldn't accomplish anything. Myers would just dismiss me as a senile old man, and the nurses, well, they'd probably just look away again. No, I needed a different approach, something more subtle, more strategic, something that would expose Myers for what he was. Arrogant, reckless, and ultimately dangerous. I thought about going to the chief of staff, lodging a formal complaint. But that felt messy, like airing dirty laundry. Besides, what proof did I have? Just my word against his. And who would they believe? The respected senior physician or the rising star surgeon? The answer was obvious. No, a formal complaint wouldn't do. I needed something more concrete. I started pacing, my mind racing. I needed a plan, a strategy, something that would expose Myers' incompetence without directly confronting him, something that would use his own arrogance against him. I thought about all the times I'd seen young doctors, full of themselves, make mistakes. Mistakes born of overconfidence, of a lack of respect for experience. Myers was no different. He was just more blatant about it. The idea began to take shape. I wouldn't attack him directly. I'd let him dig his own grave. I'd let his arrogance be his undoing. I just needed to find the right opportunity, the right leverage. I needed to find the cracks in his armor, and I had a feeling they were there. Underneath all that bravado, underneath that veneer of confidence, I suspected Myers was hiding something. A weakness, an insecurity, something I could use. It wouldn't be easy. It would require patience, careful observation, and a bit of, well, let's just say I'd need to be resourceful. I was retired, yes, but that didn't mean I was out of the game. I still had my contacts, my knowledge, my reputation. And I was determined to use them, not for revenge, but for justice, for the sake of the patients, for the sake of the hospital, and yes, for my own sake. I decided then and there that I wouldn't let Ethan Myers get away with this. I would find a way to expose him, to hold him accountable for his arrogance and his recklessness. It was a decision born of anger and hurt, yes, but also of a deep sense of responsibility. A responsibility to the profession I loved, to the patients I'd sworn to protect, and to myself. I was done being a ghost. It was time to remind everyone who Caleb Beaumont was. I knew I needed to understand Ethan Myers better to find his weaknesses. My plan, whatever it was going to be, depended on it. I couldn't just barge in, guns blazing. That wasn't my way. I needed to be subtle, strategic. I needed to gather information, to observe, to listen. I needed, in other words, to become a bit of a detective. So I started spending more time at the hospital. Not in any official capacity, mind you. I'd just pop in, visit old colleagues, grab a coffee in the cafeteria, stroll through the wards. I became a fixture, a friendly face, a harmless old retiree. But I was watching, always watching. I'd make a point of being around when Myers was doing his rounds. I'd stand back, observe his interactions with the staff, with the patients. I noticed he was always quick to interrupt, to dismiss concerns, to talk down to people. He had this air of superiority about him, like he was the only one who knew anything. He'd correct nurses, contradict other doctors, and barely acknowledge the patients themselves. He seemed more interested in showing off his knowledge than in actually listening to what people had to say. The nurses, especially the younger ones, seemed intimidated by him. They jumped to attention whenever he spoke, eager to please. The older nurses, the ones I'd trained, they were more reserved. I could see a flicker of resentment in their eyes, a hint of disapproval. But they kept their mouths shut. They knew the pecking order. Myers was the rising star, the golden boy, and they were just nurses. I'd strike up conversations with the staff, casual, innocuous chit-chat. I'd ask about their families, their hobbies, their work. And then I'd subtly steer the conversation towards Myers. "How's Dr. Myers doing?" I'd ask. "Seems like a bright young man." And then I'd listen, really listen. The responses were always carefully measured. "Oh, he's very efficient," one nurse told me, "keeps things moving." Another said, "He's certainly confident." There was always a hesitation, a slight pause before they answered, a subtle shift in their tone. It was like they wanted to say more, but they were holding back, afraid, perhaps, of saying the wrong thing. Or maybe they were just being cautious, protecting their jobs. The whispers in the corridors were more revealing. Snippets of conversations overheard in passing. "Did you hear about what happened in OR3? I swear, that man's ego is bigger than this hospital. Someone needs to put him in his place." It was all very hushed, very discreet. But it was there. A simmering discontent, a growing unease. Myers was making enemies, and I was starting to understand why. I learned that he had a reputation for being difficult, demanding, impatient, unwilling to listen to anyone but himself. He'd clash with nurses, argue with colleagues, and even berate patients. He seemed to thrive on conflict, on proving he was the smartest person in the room. It was all starting to come together. The arrogance, the recklessness, the disregard for others. It was a dangerous combination, and I knew with a growing certainty that it was only a matter of time before it caught up with him. I just needed to find the right moment, the right opportunity to expose him, and I was determined to find it. I was sitting in the cafeteria, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, when Sarah Jennings came over. Sarah was one of the nurses I'd trained years ago. A good nurse, conscientious and compassionate. She'd always been a bit quiet, but I could tell she had a good head on her shoulders. "Mind if I join you, Caleb?" she asked, her voice low. I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Always a pleasure, Sarah." We chatted for a bit about this and that, the usual hospital gossip. Then she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what happened with Dr. Myers the other day," she said, "with George Miller." I nodded, my heart sinking a little. "It was unpleasant." "It was more than unpleasant, Caleb," she said, her eyes flashing. "It was disrespectful, to you and to George." I sighed. "It's not the first time something like that's happened, Sarah. I'm getting used to it." She shook her head. "You shouldn't have to get used to it. You deserve better." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I thought you should see this," she said, handing it to me. I unfolded the paper. It was a copy of Ethan Myers' surgical notes from a recent procedure. My eyes scanned the page, my years of experience allowing me to quickly decipher the medical jargon. And as I read, a cold dread washed over me. The notes were sloppy, incomplete. There were inconsistencies, contradictions, and outright errors. Myers had clearly rushed through the procedure, cutting corners, taking unnecessary risks. He documented things that hadn't happened and failed to document things that had. It was a mess, a dangerous, potentially fatal mess. My hand trembled slightly as I refolded the paper. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I made a copy," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I was concerned about some of the things I saw during the surgery. I tried to talk to Dr. Myers, but he wouldn't listen. He just brushed me off, said I didn't know what I was talking about." I looked at Sarah, my heart aching foe. She'd done the right thing, tried to speak up to protect the patient, and she'd been silenced, just like I had. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You did the right thing. This is important." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. I just, I had to do something, Caleb. I couldn't just stand by and watch him hurt someone. I squeezed her hand. I understand, I said, and I won't let this go to waste. Sarah left shortly after, leaving me alone with Myers' telltale notes. I sat there for a long time, staring at the folded piece of paper, my mind racing. This was it. This was the leverage I'd been looking for, the proof I needed to expose Myers' incompetence. His arrogance, his recklessness, it was all laid bare in those sloppy, careless notes. He thought he was too clever, too important to be questioned. He thought he could get away with anything, but he was wrong, dead wrong. I now had the ammunition I needed. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight, not for revenge, not really, but for justice. For the sake of the patients, for the sake of the hospital, and yes, for my own sake. It was time to remind everyone who Caleb Beaumont was, and it was time to teach Ethan Myers a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. I had Sarah's copy of Myers' surgical notes tucked safely away in my briefcase. They were damning, no doubt about it, but they weren't enough. I needed more. I needed to find a specific case, a specific instance where Myers' incompetence could have real, tangible consequences. I needed a smoking gun. So I started digging. I spent hours in the medical library, poring over journals, reviewing case studies, refreshing my knowledge of the latest surgical techniques. I also started subtly inquiring about Myers' upcoming cases. I'd chat with nurses, ask casual questions about the surgical schedule, feigning an interest in keeping up with the latest happenings at the hospital. It wasn't easy. People were understandably hesitant to share confidential patient information with a retiree, even one with my history. But I was persistent, and eventually I started to get some leads. I learned that Myers was scheduled to perform a particularly complex procedure on a patient with a rare heart condition. The surgery was high risk, requiring meticulous planning and precise execution. Even experienced surgeons approached such cases with caution. I got my hands on the patient's file, again through discreet inquiries and a bit of, let's just say, I knew how to navigate the hospital's information system. I studied the file carefully, reviewing the patient's medical history, the diagnostic images, the proposed surgical plan. And as I read, my stomach sank. Myers' plan was flawed, fundamentally flawed. He'd chosen a surgical approach that was unnecessarily aggressive, ignoring less invasive options that would have been safer for the patient. He'd also overlooked a key anatomical detail that could lead to serious complications during the surgery. It was clear he'd rushed through the planning process, relying on his own perceived brilliance rather than carefully considering the patient's specific needs. His arrogance was, once again, on full display. It was like he'd taken a sledgehammer to a problem that required a scalpel. If he went through with his plan, the patient could suffer serious, potentially life-threatening consequences. It was reckless, irresponsible, and frankly, terrifying. I knew I had to do something. This wasn't just about my own bruised ego anymore. This was about a patient's life. I couldn't just stand by and let Myers make a potentially fatal mistake. I had to find a way to stop him. But how? I couldn't just march into the operating room and tell him he was wrong. He wouldn't listen. He'd just dismiss me as a meddling old fool. I needed a more strategic approach, something that would expose his incompetence without putting the patient at further risk. I thought about going to the chief of staff, but I hesitated. I still didn't have enough concrete evidence, and I didn't want to risk tipping Myers off prematurely. I needed to catch him in the act, so to speak. I needed to let him expose his own incompetence. Then it hit me, the staff conference. Every week the surgical team met to discuss upcoming cases, to review surgical plans, and to share best practices. It was a perfect opportunity. Myers would be there presenting his plan for this high-risk surgery, confident in his own brilliance. And I would be there too, waiting for the right moment to strike. My plan began to crystallize. I wouldn't confront Myers directly. I'd let him present his plan, let him dig his own grave. And then, when he was finished, I would politely, respectfully ask a few questions. Questions that would expose the flaws in his logic, the gaps in his knowledge, the recklessness of his approach. I'd let his own arrogance be his undoing. I spent the next few days meticulously preparing. I reviewed the patient's file again and again, memorizing every detail. I researched alternative surgical approaches, gathering evidence to support my arguments. I practiced my questions, carefully crafting them to be both pointed and polite. I wanted to expose Myers' incompetence without appearing confrontational, without giving him any ammunition to dismiss me as a bitter old man. It was a risky plan. It could backfire spectacularly, but I was determined to see it through. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the patient, about the integrity of the hospital, about the very essence of what it meant to be a doctor, and I was ready to fight for it. I knew I couldn't go in with guns blazing. Direct confrontation with Myers wouldn't work. He'd just dismiss me, write me off as a senile old man clinging to the past. No, I needed a different approach. I needed to be smart, strategic. I needed to use Myers' own arrogance against him. Let him hoist himself with his own petard, so to speak. The idea came to me as I was reviewing the hospital's weekly schedule. Every Thursday morning, the surgical department held a staff conference. All the surgeons, residents, and senior nurses attended. It was a forum for discussing upcoming cases, reviewing surgical plans, and sharing best practices. And most importantly, it was a platform for surgeons to present their proposed approaches to complex cases. It was the perfect opportunity. Myers would be there, presenting his plan for this high-risk heart surgery, brimming with confidence, no doubt eager to impress his colleagues. And I would be there too, sitting quietly in the back, observing, listening, waiting for my moment. My strategy was simple, yet I hoped effective. I would let Myers present his entire plan, uninterrupted. Let him lay out his flawed logic, his reckless approach, for all to see. Let him bask in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. And then, when he was finished, when he was at the peak of his self-assuredness, I would speak. I wouldn't attack him directly. I wouldn't accuse him of incompetence. I wouldn't raise my voice. I would simply ask questions. Polite, respectful questions. Questions that would, ever so gently, expose the cracks in his armor. Questions that would highlight the risks he'd overlooked, the alternatives he'd ignored, the potential consequences of his arrogance. I imagined the scene playing out in my head. Myers standing at the podium, confidently outlining his surgical plan, using all the latest medical jargon, dazzling the younger staff with his technical prowess. And then me, the quiet old retiree in the back row, raising my hand, asking a simple question. "Dr. Myers," I would say, my voice calm and steady, "I was just curious about your choice of surgical approach. Have you considered the potential complications associated with that particular technique in a patient with this specific condition?" And then I'd watch as his composure began to crumble. I'd watch as he struggled to defend his flawed plan, his confidence slowly eroding under the weight of my carefully crafted questions. I wouldn't have to accuse him of anything. He would do that himself. His own arrogance would be his undoing. It was a risky strategy, I knew. It relied on Myers' ego, on his inability to admit he might be wrong. But I was willing to gamble. I had nothing left to lose, really, and the potential payoff was significant. Not just for the patient whose life was on the line, but for the integrity of the hospital, for the standards of the profession I loved, and yes, for my own self-respect. This wouldn't be a shouting match. This wouldn't be a dramatic showdown. This would be a quiet dismantling, a silent strategy executed with precision and patience. I wouldn't have to raise my voice to be heard. Truth, I believed, would speak for itself. And Myers, in his arrogance, would provide all the evidence I needed. I knew I couldn't rely on the surgical notes alone. They were damning, yes, but they lacked context. They didn't tell the whole story. I needed something more. Something that would connect the dots, that would show a pattern of recklessness, a disregard for patient safety. I also needed to be careful. I couldn't just go around accusing Myers of incompetence. I needed to be subtle, strategic. I needed to plant seeds of doubt, to raise questions without directly pointing fingers. So I started reaching out to some of my trusted colleagues, doctors I'd worked with for years, doctors whose opinions carried weight. I didn't tell them everything, of course. I didn't show them the surgical notes. I just casually mentioned my concerns about Myers, expressing my reservations about his approach to certain cases. Have you noticed anything unusual about Dr. Myers's recent surgeries? I'd ask, my voice carefully neutral. I've heard some whispers, some concerns about his decision-making process. I was vague, letting them fill in the blanks, and they did. They shared their own observations, their own anxieties. They'd noticed his arrogance, his impatience, his tendency to dismiss the opinions of others. They'd heard the same whispers I had, the same rumors of near misses and close calls. They were worried, but they were also hesitant to speak up. Myers was, after all, a rising star, protected by the hospital administration. My conversations with these colleagues served two purposes. First, they confirmed my suspicions about Myers. They validated my concerns, assuring me that I wasn't just a bitter old man imagining things. Second, and more importantly, they planted seeds of doubt. They subtly shifted the narrative, creating an atmosphere of unease around Myers. They prepared the ground for what was to come. I also made a point of talking to some of the senior nurses, the ones I'd trained years ago. I didn't tell them about my plan, but I reminded them of the principles I'd instilled in them. The importance of patient advocacy, the responsibility to speak up when something wasn't right. I reminded them that their voices mattered, that they had a duty to protect their patients, even if it meant challenging a doctor's authority. It was a delicate dance, a subtle game of manipulation. I had to be careful not to reveal my hand, not to give Myers any warning of what was coming. I had to let him think he was in control, let him believe he was untouchable. By the time the staff conference rolled around, the stage was set. The seeds of doubt had been planted. The whispers had grown louder. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. And I, the quiet old retiree in the back row, was ready. My silent strategy was in place, and I was confident that it would work. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew the truth would eventually come out. And when it did, Ethan Myers would have no one to blame but himself. I knew I couldn't just spring this on Myers and the rest of the staff. I needed to lay some groundwork, create an atmosphere of, let's just say, healthy skepticism. I wasn't about to go around accusing Myers outright. That would just make me look like a disgruntled old-timer with an axe to grind. No, I needed to be more subtle. I needed to plant some seeds of doubt, let them germinate, and then, when the time was right, let them blossom into full-blown suspicion. So I started making the rounds, so to speak. Casual visits to the hospital, quick chats with old colleagues, harmless conversations in the cafeteria. I focused on the senior staff, the ones who'd been around for a while, the ones whose opinions carried weight. I didn't mention the surgical notes, not yet. I just casually brought up Myers' name, gauging their reactions, testing the waters. "How's that young Dr. Myers doing?" I'd ask, trying to sound like a curious old retiree just keeping up with the hospital gossip. "Seems like a bright young man, plenty of ambition." And then I'd listen, really listen. Most of the responses were non-committal, carefully neutral. "Oh, he's efficient," one doctor told me with a slight hesitation. "Keeps things moving." Another said, "He's certainly confident," with a barely perceptible raise of an eyebrow. But there were others, the ones who knew me better, the ones who trusted my judgment, who offered more revealing insights. "He's a bit headstrong," one old colleague confided, lowering his voice. "Doesn't always listen to advice." Another said, "He seems to think he knows it all. A bit too quick to dismiss other opinions, if you know what I mean." I nodded sagely, letting their words hang in the air. I didn't have to say anything negative about Myers. They were doing it for me. I just had to nudge them in the right direction, let their own observations confirm my suspicions. I also made a point of talking to some of the senior nurses, the ones I'd trained, the ones I knew I could trust. Again, I was careful not to reveal too much. I just casually mentioned that I'd heard some concerns about Myers' recent performance. Nothing specific, just enough to pique their interest to get them thinking. Have you noticed anything unusual in the OR lately? I'd ask, my voice soft, almost conspiratorial. Just curious, with all these new techniques and procedures. And they responded cautiously at first, then with growing candor. They told me about Myers' impatience, his tendency to rush through procedures, his dismissive attitude towards nurses' concerns. They shared stories of near misses, of close calls, of moments when they'd had to step in to prevent a mistake. They were worried, they said, but they were also afraid to speak up, afraid of retaliation, afraid of being labeled as troublemakers. I listened patiently, offering words of encouragement, reminding them of the importance of patient safety, of the ethical obligations of their profession. I reminded them that their voices mattered, that they had a right, a duty to speak up when something wasn't right. I didn't have to tell them what to do. They knew. They'd always known. I taught them that myself all those years ago. They just needed a little nudge, a little reassurance that they weren't alone. By the time the staff conference rolled around, the seeds of doubt had been sown. The whispers had started. The ground was fertile. And I, the quiet old retiree in the back row, was ready to harvest my crop. Well, Thursday morning rolled around and I made my way to the hospital. I felt a strange mix of nerves and anticipation. This was it. Showtime. I found a seat in the back of the conference room, trying to blend in, to look like just another observer. The room filled up quickly with surgeons, residents, and nurses. There was a low hum of conversation, the usual pre-meeting chatter. Then Ethan Myers strode in, his white coat crisp, his hair perfectly styled. He had that same air of confidence, that same smug look on his face that had so irritated me before. He took his place at the podium, his presence commanding the room. He began his presentation, outlining his surgical plan for the complex heart case I'd been studying. He spoke with authority, using all the latest medical jargon, peppering his speech with acronyms and technical terms. He clearly knew his stuff, at least on a theoretical level. He clicked through slides, displaying diagrams and images of the patient's heart, explaining his proposed surgical approach in detail. He spoke of innovative techniques, of minimizing invasiveness, of maximizing positive outcomes. He sounded confident, almost arrogant, like he was the only one in the room who truly understood the complexities of the case. I listened intently, my eyes fixed on him, my mind racing. He was good, I had to give him that. He knew how to present a case, how to make it sound convincing, even impressive. But underneath the polished veneer, I could see the cracks. The overconfidence, the lack of nuance, the subtle disregard for the inherent risks involved. He was so focused on showcasing his own brilliance that he'd overlooked some crucial details. Details that could have serious, even fatal consequences for the patient. He finished his presentation with a flourish, a confident smile spreading across his face. He looked around the room, expecting, I imagined, a chorus of praise and admiration. There was a moment of silence, a pregnant pause, and then I raised my hand. "Dr. Myers," I said, my voice calm and steady, just loud enough to be heard over the quiet murmur in the room. "Thank you for that comprehensive presentation. I was particularly interested in your choice of surgical approach. Could you perhaps elaborate on why you opted for that particular technique, given the patient's unique anatomical considerations?" Myers turned towards me, his smile faltering slightly. He clearly hadn't expected a question, let alone one from a retired physician sitting in the back row. He hesitated for a moment, then cleared his throat. Well, as I explained, this approach offers the most direct access to the affected area, allowing for a more efficient and precise repair, he said, his voice a touch defensive. I understand, I replied, my tone still neutral. But have you considered the potential complications associated with that approach in a patient with this specific type of valve malformation? The proximity of the coronary artery, as indicated in the angiogram, presents a significant risk of accidental damage, doesn't it? Myers shifted uncomfortably, his confidence beginning to waver. Of course, we're aware of the anatomical considerations, he said, a little too quickly. But we've taken precautions to mitigate those risks. And what precautions would those be, Dr. Myers? I asked, my voice still soft, but with a subtle edge. The surgical notes don't seem to specify any particular measures to protect the coronary artery during this critical phase of the procedure. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Heads turned, the atmosphere shifted. Myers's face flushed slightly. He stammered, well, the standard precautions, of course. We'll be using, specialized instruments and techniques. Could you be more specific, Dr. Myers? I pressed gently. Which specialized instruments? Which specific techniques? The patient's file doesn't seem to indicate any deviation from the standard protocol for this type of surgery. Myers was visibly flustered now. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He glanced at the chief of staff, a look of panic flashing across his face. The room was silent, everyone watching, waiting. The trap had been sprung. Myers stammered, his face now a deep shade of red. The surgical plan, it's still being finalized. I see, I said, my voice still calm. So, you're proposing a high-risk surgical approach on a patient with a complex heart condition without a fully finalized plan, without specific protocols in place to address the potential complications I've just outlined. Myers's composure completely crumbled. He started to sweat, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape route. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stood there, frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was staring at him, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright disapproval. The chief of staff, Dr. Thompson, a stern, no-nonsense woman I'd known for years, cleared her throat. Dr. Myers, she said, her voice sharp and cold, perhaps you could explain to us why your surgical plan lacks the specific details Dr. Beaumont has just highlighted. Myers mumbled something about needing to consult with his team, about needing more time to review the case. He tried to deflect, to blame others, to downplay the seriousness of the situation. But it was too late, the damage had been done. His arrogance, his recklessness, it was all out in the open for everyone to see. Dr. Thompson wasn't buying it. Dr. Myers, she said, her voice rising slightly, this is a high-risk procedure. We need to be absolutely certain that every possible complication has been considered, that every necessary precaution has been taken. Your lack of preparedness is concerning, to say the least. Myers stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't think. You didn't think? Dr. Thompson interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Dr. Myers, thinking is a fundamental requirement in our profession, especially when a patient's life is on the line. The room was buzzing now, with whispers and murmurs of disapproval. The younger staff, the ones who had initially been impressed by Myers's bravado, were now looking at him with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. The older nurses, the ones I'd trained, they were nodding their heads, their expressions a mix of vindication and quiet satisfaction. Myers tried to regain his composure, to salvage the situation. He started rambling about his experience, his expertise, his success rate, but it was no use. He'd lost the room, he'd lost their respect, he'd lost the trust. He was unraveling right before our eyes. His carefully constructed facade of brilliance was crumbling, revealing the insecure, reckless young man beneath. His arrogance, which had once seemed so impenetrable, had become his Achilles heel. He'd been so busy trying to impress everyone, so focused on showcasing his own brilliance that he'd forgotten the most important thing, the patient. And now he was paying the price. His reputation, his career, his future, it was all hanging in the balance. And I, the quiet old retiree in the back row, had done nothing more than ask a few simple questions. I hadn't had to raise my voice, hadn't had to resort to accusations or insults. I'd simply let the truth speak for itself. And the truth, as it so often does, had a way of revealing itself in the end. Just as some were starting to shift uncomfortably, maybe thinking I was being too hard on the young fella, Sarah Jennings spoke up. Sarah, one of the nurses I'd trained years ago, stood up, her voice clear and steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "I'd like to add something," she said, her gaze fixed on Dr. Thompson. "During the prep for Dr. Myers's recent laparoscopic cholecystectomy on Mrs. Henderson, I noticed he hadn't marked the surgical site correctly. He'd marked the wrong quadrant." The room went completely silent. Every eye turned to Sarah. Myers' face paled even further. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "I pointed out the error to Dr. Myers," she said, "but he dismissed my concern. He said he knew what he was doing, that I was wasting his time." She paused, took a deep breath, and then continued. "Had I not insisted, he would have made the incision in the wrong place. Mrs. Henderson could have suffered serious complications, potentially life-threatening ones." A collective gasp went through the room. This wasn't just a theoretical discussion anymore. This was a real incident, a near miss, with potentially devastating consequences. And it had been caused by Myers's arrogance, his refusal to listen to a nurse, to acknowledge a simple but potentially catastrophic error. Myers sputtered, trying to defend himself. That's not how it happened," he stammered. "It was a minor miscommunication. I would never." But no one was listening to him anymore. The damage was done. Sarah's testimony had corroborated everything I'd been saying. It had confirmed his recklessness, his disregard for patient safety, his dangerous overconfidence. He'd not only dismissed my concerns, but he'd also ignored a nurse's warning, a warning that could have saved a patient's life. Sarah sat down, her face pale but resolute. She'd done what she had to do. She'd spoken truth to power, even though it had probably terrified her. She'd upheld the principles I'd taught her all those years ago, the principles of patient advocacy, of speaking up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I felt a surge of pride for her courage, for her integrity. She'd done what none of the others had been able to do. She'd debroken the silence. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Dr. Thompson looked at Myers, her expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Dr. Myers," she said, her voice cold and hard, "I think we've heard enough." Dr. Thompson didn't waste any more time. She addressed the room, her voice firm and authoritative. "I want to thank Dr. Beaumont and Nurse Jennings for bringing these serious matters to our attention," she said, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the assembled staff. "Their concerns clearly warrant a thorough investigation." She turned to Myers, her expression hardening. "Dr. Myers," she said, "your conduct in this matter has been, frankly, appalling. Your arrogance, your recklessness, and your blatant disregard for patient safety are unacceptable. You have not only jeopardized the well-being of your patients, but you have also undermined the trust and confidence of your colleagues and the hospital administration." Myers stood there speechless, his face ashen. He tried to speak, to offer some kind of defense, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there, swaying slightly, like a boxer who'd just taken a knockout punch. "Effective immediately," Dr. Thompson continued. "You are suspended from all surgical duties pending a full review of your cases. We will be conducting a thorough investigation into your performance, your decision-making process, and your adherence to hospital protocols. Depending on the findings of this investigation, further disciplinary action may be taken, up to and including termination of your employment." A wave of murmurs went through the room. Some were shocked, others were relieved, and still others looked, well, a little bit gleeful. Myers's fall from grace was complete. His arrogance, which had once seemed so impenetrable, had finally caught up with him. He mumbled something about needing to talk to his lawyer, about needing to explain himself. But Dr. Thompson cut him off. "That will be all, Dr. Myers," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "You may leave now." Myers turned and practically fled the room, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. The room erupted in a cacophony of whispers and hushed conversations. The young surgeon who had seemed so invincible, so untouchable, had been brought down, not by a dramatic confrontation, not by a public showdown, but by a few carefully chosen words, a few pointed questions, and the brave testimony of a nurse who refused to be silenced. I sat there quietly, watching it all unfold. I didn't feel a sense of triumph, not really. Just a quiet sense of satisfaction, a feeling that justice had been served. Myers had brought this on himself. His arrogance, his recklessness, it had all led to this inevitable downfall. He thought he was above the rules, above reproach. He thought he could get away with anything. But he'd been wrong, dead wrong. And I, the quiet old retiree in the back row, had played a small but crucial role in his downfall. I hadn't had to shout, hadn't had to resort to anger or accusations. I'd simply used his own arrogance against him, letting the truth speak for itself. And in the end, that's all it took. The truth, like a scalpel, had exposed the flaws beneath the surface, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. And now he was paying the price. It wasn't revenge, not really. It was just justice. A quiet, understated justice delivered with precision and patience. And that, I thought, was the most satisfying kind of all. Months drifted by. The leaves turned, the air grew crisp, and life settled back into its familiar rhythm. I went back to my retirement routine, tending my garden, reading books, spending time with Martha. The hospital, once the center of my universe, became a distant memory. I rarely went back, except for the occasional checkup. The whispers about Ethan Myers eventually faded, replaced by new hospital gossip, new dramas unfolding within those familiar walls. I heard he'd left St. Jude's, moved to another state trying to rebuild his career. I didn't dwell on it. It was over. Finished. A closed chapter in my life. The sting of that initial humiliation, the disrespect I'd felt, it gradually dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of vindication. I hadn't sought revenge, not really. I'd simply wanted to protect the patients, to uphold the standards of my profession, to reclaim my own self-respect. And I'd done that, not with anger or confrontation, but with quiet strategy and unwavering patience. I realized that sometimes, the most effective way to deal with arrogance is to simply let it run its course. Arrogance is like a disease, a cancer that eats away at the soul, blinding its host to their own flaws, their own vulnerabilities. Myers's arrogance had been his undoing. He'd been so blinded by his own perceived brilliance that he hadn't seen the trap he was setting for himself. He'd been so busy trying to impress everyone that he'd forgotten the most important thing: the well-being of his patients. I found a renewed appreciation for the simple pleasures of life, the warmth of the sun on my face, the smell of freshly cut grass, the laughter of my grandchildren. Things I'd taken for granted during my busy years at the hospital. Retirement, I discovered, wasn't about fading away, about becoming irrelevant. It was about rediscovering oneself, about finding new meaning and purpose in life beyond the confines of a career. I still miss the hospital sometimes, the adrenaline rush of a difficult surgery, the satisfaction of seeing a patient recover, the camaraderie of my colleagues. But I didn't miss the politics, the pressure, the constant struggle for recognition. I'd had my time in the spotlight. Now it was time to step back too. Let others take the reins. My reputation, once tarnished by Myers's dismissive words, had been quietly restored. My colleagues, the ones who had witnessed that humiliating encounter, now treated me with renewed respect. They understood what I'd done, why I'd done it. They saw that my actions hadn't been motivated by bitterness or revenge, but by a deep sense of responsibility, a commitment to the principles I'd always upheld. Sitting on my porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, I reflected on the events of the past few months. I'd learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes the best way to fight isn't with fists or fury, but with silence and strategy. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the truth. And sometimes the greatest victory is the one achieved quietly, without fanfare, without the need for public recognition. It was a quiet vindication, a peaceful resolution to a conflict that had threatened to define the final chapter of my career. And in that quietness, I found a profound sense of peace. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened with that young Dr. Myers. Sitting here on my porch, watching the world go by, I've come to realize something important. Sometimes the best way to deal with arrogance isn't to fight fire with fire. It's not about shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes the best approach is patience. Just letting things unfold, letting the truth reveal itself in its own time. You see, arrogance is like a weed. It grows quickly, choking out everything around it. It thrives on attention, on validation. But if you ignore it, if you deprive it of the sunlight it craves, it eventually withers and dies. That's what happened with Myers. He was so consumed by his own ego, so blinded by his own perceived brilliance, that he didn't see the trap he was setting for himself. He thought he was untouchable, above reproach, but he was. Nobody is. And the truth? Well, the truth is like a persistent little seed. It might take a while to sprout, but eventually it finds a way to break through the surface, to reach for the light. And when it does, it can topple even the mightiest of weeds. In Myers's case, the truth was in those sloppy surgical notes, in the hushed whispers of concerned nurses, in the uneasy silence of his colleagues. It was there all along, waiting to be revealed. I didn't have to do much, really. I just had to nudge things along a bit, plant a few seeds of doubt, and then step back and let nature take its course. Patience, you see, is a powerful weapon. It allows you to see things clearly, to strategize, to choose your battles wisely. And sometimes, the wisest battle is the one you don't fight at all. And truth, well, that's another powerful weapon. It's like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and unwavering. It can cut through layers of deception, expose hidden flaws, and reveal the true nature of things. And in the end, the truth always prevails. It might take time, it might require patience, but it always wins. So if you find yourself facing arrogance, remember my story. Remember the lesson I learned. Don't get drawn into a shouting match. Don't waste your energy on anger or resentment. Just be patient. Let the truth do its work. And trust me, it will. Now, if you enjoyed this story of an underestimated elder getting their rightful revenge, subscribe to Retirement Stories for more inspiring tales of resilience and justice.